Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to the 16th century, and we're going to be looking at the life of Martin Luther. And to do that, we have a special guest on this program. He's the host of the podcast Lutheran Answers. His name is Remy Shepherd. Welcome to the podcast, Remy.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And you know, when we were talking about Luther, Martin Luther and Lutheranism, I thought there's no better person to go to than someone who is an active part of the Lutheran Church.
Yeah, that's a good thought.
Yeah. So we're going to go back and we're going to be looking at the life of Martin Luther. And you know, Chris, you and I are both coming from the Baptist background, so a little different, but we both also have very strong backgrounds, obviously in history, but also in church history.
Right. And though tonight we'll kind of go in many different directions, we're going to look at theology and we'll talk about, religion. But really, at the end of the day, there's few men who have really changed the course of history like Martin Luther. And I mean, people know Martin Luther in some form, in some sense of something that he did. They might not truly understand what the Protestant Reformation was all about. But if you mention Martin Luther, somebody might think, oh, the guy that nailed something to a door, or the guy that, stood up for his faith. And so I look forward to hearing, kind of some discussion about Luther and his transformation. But I think, Ray, it's also important to understand that this is a story of humanity as well, because, Martin Luther rises to the heights of triumph and to success, but there's also the despair of being, hated and because of what he believed in, and that people rejected him, and all he was trying to do was right. And so I think that in our society, we find this constant battle between good and evil that is taking place. We also see this fight for religious viewpoints in our society, but also throughout the world. And so we've got to go all the way back and just look at the story of Luther and how Luther transforms not just history, but also religion.
Yeah, Luther is very much a human figure. A lot of times we look at historical figures, whether it's someone like Martin Luther or George Washington or whoever it may be, a lot of times people view them as statues, sort of these maybe one-dimensional figures, and there's so much more to these people. One of the most interesting aspects of Luther's life that I've always latched onto was his early years before he became a monk, before history even noticed him. Of course, he's born in 1483, just about 9 years before Christopher Columbus makes his famous voyage and discovers, quote unquote, the New World. He's born to a guy called Hans Luther. And I think Luther, in my understanding, Remy, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that Luther really, I think, wanted Martin Luther to go into law. That was his goal for Luther.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he never, I don't think he ever, he accepted young Martin's monasticism, but it always, I guess, seemed begrudging. I don't know that he ever really got over the fact that his son wasn't a lawyer, because Hans worked very hard to provide a wonderful life for his family, and just always expected his eldest to move on to something like the law that was, prestigious and influential and sort of the mark of upper class, I guess. It just seemed like the natural move for him.
Yeah, and it also was something that Hans had to pay for, because Luther did go to law school. So this is something that Hans Luther would have had to have put the bill for. There was no financial aid at this time. So this is something he would have had to pay for. And Luther goes to school to become a lawyer at the University of Erfurt. And Chris, things change pretty quick.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go back to Remy and ask him kind of a question as it relates to Dad. If we look at the story of the family, Luther Martin sometimes seems to paint a story that he kind of came out from a very poor background. But as both of you have just mentioned, his father really worked hard to make sure that it wasn't a poor background. So do you think that kind of was a needle to his dad in a way, kind of saying, I was poor and I had to fight for everything that I had, when, his dad basically had his family in not a rich setting, but a modest income?
He would have been poor, I think, probably initially growing up. But as time went on, his dad went from working at mines, I believe, to owning and leasing them out, working his way sort of up, saving and working that way. And as far as I understand of Luther's education, his father's responsibility would have been purchasing the books, which would have been probably the most enormous cost at the time, because we're, either pre-printing press or very early printing press. So it's handwritten books, likely what's available from these ancient teachers and whatnot. So this would have been expensive. And his father did buy him all of his books. But once he was sent to college, it was very common for young men in these places to panhandle, and they were often given exemptions by the law to do so, to help them cover at least room and board, if not more.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand, Remy, that he had a number of classmates die while he was there at school. You know anything about that?
A number of classmates, a number of siblings. A lot of people died. There was a lot of disease at that time. And this was before the plague rocked Europe, because he was a pastor when that happened, and it suffered a lot of death then as well. But yeah, at that point in time, he was, at one point, even his father, Hans, had gotten word that Martin had also died. And
I remember reading something that there was a time in which Martin had injured himself with a sword, and that they thought that he was going to die, but they were able to get him to a doctor and sew him up fast. But that led to Martin actually having a fear of dying, the fear of death. We'll talk about the religious aspect in a moment and what that meant for him. But he just had this fear of death, that death followed him. And maybe it's kind of what you were talking about with the plague. Maybe it's talking about seeing his friends and siblings and other things. But I think he really lived in fear of dying. And therefore, when the event, Ray, that we're going to go to next happens, I think that played a huge role in him saying, okay, here's part 2 of my life.
Possibly prior to what he called his tower experience, I would say. I don't know historically, at least theologically, his writings and sermons and things towards the later half of his life don't necessarily imply a fear of death. But early on, you can see that. And I think I know what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, I think a lot of people share one of Luther's fears, and that was fears of thunderstorms, specifically fear of being struck by lightning. So he's returning home from school, and lo and behold, he gets caught in a storm. And you could just imagine this young man, running for his life in the field or along the road. And actually, I believe lightning comes very close to him, or a bolt of lightning comes very close to him, and he falls on the ground, and he vows to become a monk if Saint Anne would save him from this storm.
Mm-hmm. Saint Anna, the mother of Mary. Yeah, I believe was the invocation there.
Did you know? Is there a specific reason why he called on her? Is that just?
I do not know. That is not something I know. I don't know if that's even Luther. Luther ended up being so against the idea of the invocation of the saints that even if there was a specific reason, I doubt he would have shared. He may have. I don't know that I've ever heard it.
It's sort of,
I would go, Ray and Remy, just in my studying of this, that Saint Anne was a popular saint during the time, but also was the patron saint of miners. And so that kind of leads to Dad and what Dad's occupation was. And that's why he called on Saint Anne, because I'm quite sure that Dad spoke of Saint Anne quite often. That's what I discovered, and that would lead me to understand why he chose him.
It makes sense because his religious upbringing was not necessarily formal, right? His religious upbringing was very much Dad's. This is a time when we don't have a family Bible, so it's not let's sit around and study the Word of God together. It's Dad says that this is what we do, and Dad gets it from the priest at Mass, and he was brought up in a very sort of stern religious kind of upbringing where the parents heard everything secondhand from the priest and passed it through to him, in the best way they could.
And I think that upbringing that you mentioned, Remy, that stern upbringing is really going to play into his conversion experience, I guess, away from Roman Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
Once it gets to that point in his life, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
He definitely, it's interesting that, I mean, in addition to being geographically nearby and at near a college he was familiar with recommendations from people he knew. I mean, these are all contributing sort of precipitating factors, but he was an Augustinian monk, which is going to be at the time considered one of the strictest monastic orders, which is very much going to echo sort of his home life of being raised under a father that encouraged work and was stern when you didn't do the things he wanted you to do. A loving father. He never denied that his father was a loving, caring man. And we even get glimpses of his stories, like in his table talks about his father laughing or relaxing after work and being a jovial sort of guy, but it doesn't change from sort of the hardness that was also present, and Luther leans into that in his monasticism.
Yeah. And that hardness also kind of led back to the commitment that, I think his dad was very committed in pretty much anything and everything that he did. And Martin learned from that. And I think that it's true, or correct me if I'm wrong, that, it was kind of one of those come to Jesus moments during that thunderstorm in which, he was like, hey, Saint Anne, if you'll help me, I promise you that if you get me through this storm, I'll become the monk. I will do it. I promise I'll do it. There's, and that the storm, he's saved from the storm, and then he says, hey, I made a vow to God and I'm going to own up to that vow. I'm going to be committed to that vow. And I think that he had a lot of friends that was trying to get him to back out of the vow and kind of giving him all kinds of excuses and saying, hey, you don't really have to do that. And he actually stood firm in that vow. So I think at a young age, doesn't that speak a lot about his maturity just as an individual, but also as he's marching forward in his religious views?
Yeah. And he was, I think, 22 at the time. And he went, after telling his parents, he had like one last sort of night with the boys where he had his childhood friends, and they sat around drinking and talking and as you do. And he told them, well, this is going to be it for me because I'm going to the monastery in the morning. And yes, they all tried to talk him out of it. And I think we're generally upset because he was brilliant linguistically. He was brilliant. He had such a good mind for thinking, and thinking in such a, not just a deep way, but a common way, a way that he was so good at teaching and so good at bringing things down to the essentials. And you can see how this sort of proclivity to education and also explanation are valuable in a legal career, right? Which he was going to abandon then. And
he eventually gets his doctorate in theology at Wittenberg. and he's going to become a professor there at Wittenberg, teaching, I believe, theology, correct?
Yes.
And that's where he first sort of expresses, let's just say, some views that were not part of, the Catholic theology.
That's where Roman Catholics, I think we could widely consider drop the ball with young Dr. Luther, was they encouraged him to read and study the fathers and the doctrines of the church and, the Bible itself. And this is where he found sort of what he found.
Yeah. He came into this deep, not just simply an academic struggle, but a personal struggle as well.
Yes.
Struggle between, I guess, what we could call, his raising with a very strict father, having a very legalistic, probably, view of God, versus what he was reading maybe in the New Testament about a merciful God, having this sort of tension that he seems to have developed.
Yes.
But don't you think that tension that's being developed and while is really focused more on the work of the church at that moment, that basically what is being preached, what is being told, as Remy has just shared, these individuals were not reading a Bible. These individuals were relying on what was being told to them. And so, you have the preacher basically telling you, thou shalt not waste a lot of money. Thou shalt not do and yet Luther's looking at what they're saying and then watching what they're doing. And he's having this crisis of faith because he's saying, wait a second, you're saying don't do this, but yet you're doing that. And so he finds that this whole Catholicism is just swamped in corruption, and he doesn't want to be a part of it. He's like, this is not what faith is supposed to be. And I mean, he's had some studying, he's searching the Bible and he's finding things. So isn't it true that the crisis of corruption within the church leads him further and further down this road of really trying to find out what it means to have a relationship with God and what it means to have your own theology?
To a degree, corruption in the church, I think, certainly set some things off. Obviously, Tetzel going through town, declaring whenever a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. And this whole getting permission from the Pope to pay to gather indulgences in cash to pay for, I forget what it was, but Leo X was the Pope, didn't want to come out of pocket on this large church expenditure.
St. Peter's Basilica, I believe.
Yes, it was the Basilica. So instead, he authorizes Tetzel to go shake down the poor. And obviously, there was a big misgiving with that for Luther. But it's funny because when you read the 95 Theses, if you've read them, they are still very Catholic. And it's so early in Luther's sort of development theologically that the corruption up front, the obvious corruption, is a big driving factor for him. But later Luther, not too late Luther, but later Luther, we find that as he's reflected on these things over the years, the real issue is the binding of the conscience. And as you read through Lutheran theology, you find that this sort of binding of the conscience is a very big thread that runs through all of his theological work, because the Catholic Church at the time was very big on putting the onus on man for your ultimate salvation, and no one can live up to that. And so towards the end, later Luther really realizes that it's this binding of the conscience that I think was the worst thing the Catholic Church was doing, was instead of offering the free forgiveness of Christ, we're instead giving you your own to-do list.
Yeah. That's where I come in with this, that he had this great fear of death, because he knew, based on what the church was teaching, that there was no way that he was going to accumulate enough good works. He wasn't going to be able to do enough. And so he had this fear of death in thinking, I know what awaits for me. If I don't do enough, to hell I go. And so he is just really this this crisis of his conscience, and so that's when he starts developing this theology of salvation, where he starts searching the Bible on his own and starts to say, okay, it's salvation by faith, alone. That's where I'm going to find this. So I just think it's interesting how everything kind of comes together for him at this particular moment, all of these different things. I mean, here's a guy, by the way, as we mentioned early on, he's born, and not into a very rich and very well-known life. He's going against the most powerful entity in all of the world. And that's just, for me, that's pretty tough right there.
It is. Go ahead, Remy. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I got nothing. I was just agreeing with stuff.
It's very amazing. And one of the things I have in front of me is his preface to Latin writings. And he talks about how he thought, he said, I certainly thought that in this case, I should have the protector in the Pope. I think when he started a lot of, and we're going to come back to this in a minute on indulgences and Tetzel and all this stuff. I think he thought he wasn't just simply doing God's work. He was doing the Pope's work, that the Pope was going to be happy with him.
Yeah. Well, he framed his early writings what people don't realize is that up until, just about up until the excommunication and then later the Diet and what was that, 1527, 29, somewhere in there.
Yep.
He, up until that point, he thought what he was doing was writing ecumenical dialogue with the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he sent the Pope all of these things. He wasn't just out there on his own, away from everyone, passing out these writings in secret. Everything he wrote, he sent to the Pope, and the Pope never responded. And that was his gripe, was, hey, look, these are real issues that I'm bringing up here where I think we've gone astray. And he was sending them to the Pope for review, because that's what the Pope should do. And the Pope, it was blowing him off, basically.
Yeah, and if you read, and going back to his 95 Theses that you mentioned, he, of course, nailed that to the castle door there at Wittenberg in Germany, October 31st, 1517. And Remy, you mentioned this a few minutes ago. A lot of the focus of that is this idea of indulgences. And you've talked about how Tetzel was selling it, the little slogan he used. Would you mind explaining to people what exactly an indulgence was? It is. I think the Catholic Church still practices this to some degree today.
The Catholic Church still gives out an indulgence. I'm not a Catholic. I can't claim to speak too deeply on the concept. But as I understand, the Catholics view, they view heaven basically as having a bank vault with grace that all of the saints and historical Christians have earned enough grace that they get into heaven, and the excess grace they have goes into the vault in heaven. And the Pope then distributes this grace, as he has the keys to this vault, can distribute the grace amongst the people. And indulgences then are one way to sort of receive this meritorious grace without necessarily having to do the thing. So it's important theologically to understand that Catholics speak of justification and righteousness in a meritorious and infused sense, not an imparted sense. So we would speak about, in the Lutheran Church, imputed righteousness, that we are just given the righteousness of Christ, no strings attached. Whereas Catholic theology would say that we are infused over time with the righteousness of Christ via the 80 bajillion sacraments that they have, confession and all these things. And so then indulgences are a way for the Pope to grant you meritorious grace without you having to do the meritorious bit, as I understand it.
Yeah, and Tetzel, and I think, was probably abusing this, not just simply from Luther's standpoint, but also from the church's standpoint, in that he was using what you definitely consider high pressure sales techniques. But
he had cut a deal. He had cut a deal to keep some of the proceeds for himself. So it was personally beneficial to get as much money as he could.
Yeah, and I think he was emotionally blackmailing people too. And
Yeah.
again, we're talking about mostly illiterate people, on the street, who could not read, certainly didn't have access to the New Testament in their language. And he's going in there with this high pressure sales technique, basically, your poor mama, hear her soul, her cries from purgatory, and you now have the power to free her from purgatory. And it's the old, you mentioned it earlier, when a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. If you want to free your blessed mother from the pains of purgatory, you need to, give up the money.
Yeah. And so purgatory, for those that are listening that might not know, in Catholic theology, Catholics are going to hate me for this, but that's fine. It's basically hell light. And the idea is that you are not quite bad enough to go to hell, but not quite good enough to go to heaven. So you go to purgatory and you have your sin burned off until such a time, eons from now, that you are pure and holy enough to get into heaven. And so one way to shortcut this is through indulgences, prayers for the dead, etc.
Yeah. And you would literally buy a slip of paper from a priest
that said 1,000 years off so-and-so's purgatory.
Yeah. And that, I just don't really understood how they thought that was going to work, but that's just me.
I don't understand how, what are the actuarial tables look like for purgatory? How do you know that this gold coin is getting me 500 years off?
Well, it's because the certificate said it. But I don't see people marching into the afterlife with a copy of their little certificate. But
and so Luther, one of his big issues with this is that Jesus very clearly says, when he gives the church, not the Pope, the church, the keys, the keys to the kingdom, he says that in the office of the keys, whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven them. Whoever sins you bind, they are bound, right? And so Luther's view is, wait a second, at any point in time, you could just say everyone is forgiven and out of purgatory. Right. Why don't you do that? Isn't that the Christian thing to do? Why, if you have the ability to spare everyone of this, wouldn't you take advantage of that? And so that's why a big difference between confession and absolution, say in a Lutheran context versus a Catholic context, is a Catholic priest will say, he may give you some semblance of forgiveness, but will then give you meritorious works to make up for your sins. So many Hail Marys, so many Our Fathers, go help an old lady across the street, what have you. Whereas you confess your sin to a Lutheran pastor, and his words to you are, as a called and ordained minister of Jesus Christ, and by his authority, I forgive you all of your sins. Period. That's it.
Yeah, it's more church based.
Yeah. It's final. It's not, well, I will forgive you 500 years off your purgatory. I'll forgive half your sins. No, all of your sins.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think, that as our listeners are listening to this, that we have to also remember, once again, Martin is an obscure monk. I mean, he's really a monk from nowhere. And as the Pope had no reason to listen. Right. Yeah, he's writing these letters to the Pope, and the Pope, of course, is ignoring them because he's like, "Who's this Martin kid? I ain't got time for him." But then his ideas start catching on to people. They start listening to him, and as you guys have both eloquently said, they start questioning. And so there's this wildfire that starts to go, because what he's doing is now attacking not just the Pope, right? But now he is attacking the mighty Catholic Church, who has had its hands on not just religious matters, but political matters. I mean, it has just tentacles going everywhere. And this obscure monk is now threatening that, and he unleashes a tornado, and it is going to cause this this massive, I mean, you could call it a category 5 that is going to just rage across all of Europe and basically change the continent. And I don't think that Martin really wanted that, nor did he expect that. I think that people call him revolutionary, but I think he would have balked at that. If anything, he was a reluctant revolutionary. He didn't want all of this. He just wanted to know, when I die, what's going to happen to me? Am I good?
Yeah.
And then it just, all this other comes about.
Yeah. Well, and then there's that that comes through in a lot of his writings, and he didn't lay down really a lot of where do we go from here stuff. He didn't write, I don't think, even most of our confessional documents. That was his guys after him and the people around him, that because he didn't give much thought to those things. And as you said, you said it so beautifully, that I just want to know where I go after I die. And a lot of Luther's writings, if you read, I mean, the guy was a pastor. At the end of the day, he eventually was they got so fed up with his questioning and education, they put him in a parish sort of role as a priest and saying mass and whatnot. And he that was a role he carried with him until he died, was to just be a pastor to people and to love people. And that's where he was at. That was his bread and butter, and he didn't lay down a lot of what we think today as Lutheranism came about from his successors, guys like Chemnitz and Melanchthon and whatnot, that as they set things down.
So can I follow up and ask you a question, maybe to elaborate on this, because I found it interesting. We all know, as Ray was alluding to, that he takes these 95 Theses and he goes to the door of Wittenberg and he just nails it, and it's like making a statement. But would you say that it was his actions at the door that really started the Reformation, or was it maybe his friend and maybe Gutenberg and the press and this printing press that allowed the mailing of these letters? Because isn't it true that he mailed these letters out, this 95, he mailed them out, and that that's how they really started it?
Well, and in fact, the nailing to the chapel door, as far as I know, is a contested thing. That it's not anything we have. Like, I don't think Luther ever mentions that he actually did that.
And also, Remy, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't he write the theses in Latin, which would not have been something the average German could have read?
Most likely, he was big. That's his early education was Latin, and he was big on Latin.
So this would have been an internal, as far as he was concerned.
Yeah, to the church.
It was an internal matter for the priests and the scholars and the Pope. It wasn't something that, in his mind initially anyway, that was supposed to go and change Europe.
Well, no, and especially because the theological upbringing he had was that the laity aren't, I don't want to say important, but that was the laity don't need the Bible. The laity don't even need to take the sacrament in both kinds. That was a big controversy. Do they need to have both the body and the blood of the Lord? Isn't it sufficient for the priest to have the entire mass himself, and won't that cover the sins of the people? And these were a lot of these theological debates that were had, but all of these debates, the fact that we had them, sort of showcased the idea that, look, the laity just kind of need to come and show up and hear the words. There's even an old myth that may or may not be true, but as far as I know, it's one of the best ideas we have, that the hocus pocus for magic words, they say, the hocus pocus comes from the priest going through the Latin mass when he elevates the host and says the words of Christ in Latin, hac est corpus meum, which then the father comes home and is explaining to his children, the priest gets up there and says hocus pocus, and it becomes the body of Christ, right? And while that may or may not be true, it's as good a guess as any, right? So it just kind of showcases this idea that the laity don't need to understand. The people don't need to know. It doesn't matter if they know. The priest knows, and that's what matters. And this is the environment that he was trained in theologically. And so for him to come up with these problems with Tetzel, this isn't something that he would necessarily broadcast to the town, because, what do the people in Wittenberg know?
Yeah, they don't know anything about it.
Well, I mean, and even if he had printed it in like German, would they have been able to read it?
They wouldn't have understood what he was talking about because they didn't have the context, the theological context and the background in which to place it. Now, of course, Luther is excommunicated by the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
There's the famous in 1520.
Still excommunicated, I would like to say.
Yes.
Still excommunicated.
Yes. Pope Francis has something he needs to do, right?
Yes. Come on, Papa Francis.
That's right. In 1520, of course, you have Exsurge Domine, which condemned the teachings of Luther. And that's the famous one, "Arise, O Lord, a wild boar has invaded thy vineyard." And this is Pope Leo X responding to Luther. So at this point, Luther, or at least his movement, has gotten the Pope's attention. And then, of course, in 1521, there's the papal bull of excommunication, not only of Martin Luther, but of his followers. I find it very fascinating. And sometimes in my mind, I've sort of pointed at this as maybe one of the triggers of the Reformation itself, is that when Pope Leo X issued Exsurge Domine, condemning the teachings of Luther, Luther got a copy of this on December 10, 1520, and he publicly burned the Pope's document. I mean, you got to love that.
Yeah. Yeah. At this point, we could say that fear of death is sort of dissipated.
It's gone. It's gone. He's gotten his feet underneath him. But of course, he goes to the Diet of Worms in 1521. And I believe, Remy, he is condemned there as well.
He is. Charles V actually signed an order. He was sort of spirited away before the end of the Diet, because his followers understood that this was not going to go his way and he was going to be murdered. So he was carried away.
And Charles V was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, correct? And
yes.
So, and what happens when Luther is spirited away?
He's brought away. Charles signs an edict that declares Luther a heretic, makes all of his writings, letters, and things like this illegal to own. They were to all be burned. And Luther was to be killed if you saw him on the spot. And the edict actually guaranteed safety from consequence for anyone that would kill Luther. If you saw him, kill him, and we won't prosecute you over it, which is wild to me. Like, it's one thing to say, hey, we want this guy so we can hang him. It's another thing to say, hey, if you see this dude, you can stab him in the back and we won't care.
Yeah, and Luther, as he's spirited away, he's kidnapped. He's captured. But it's interesting.
Yes, quote unquote.
Who's the one who captures him, though? It's not the Pope. Or
no. It's and I'm not gonna remember the guy's name. The elector of
Frederick. Was it Frederick? No, I can't remember.
Frederick the Wise is the one that kidnapped him.
Yeah.
Who was his friend.
Yes.
That was, they kidnapped him.
Made it look like a kidnapping.
Yeah. Right. They knew he was going to die. And Frederick the Wise actually puts him up in his tower and feeds him. And I might be wrong in this, but I think it's while Frederick the Wise actually has him that Luther starts translating the Bible and starts putting it into the hands of the people. But I want to just go back to what Remy was saying. Say that again.
Yes, he did.
And he grew a beard. He grew a
beard.
Yes.
He grew a beard. Yes. And that during this time that you mentioned something about that fear of death had escaped, because Luther knew he was a dead man walking. There was just because his followers had to make decisions also. Once again, they had, if we side with Luther, what's to think that the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor and all these people won't come for us? And so this has now turned into a really crisis of faith, not just for Luther, but now he has a merry gang of followers that he never really probably intended, whose lives are now
in his hands.
And can you just imagine that I just imagine he wakes up one day and he thinks, oh no, what have I done? And I just, what heroism, and also what faith, but also
Yeah.
you had to have been scared to death.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, and I think, I mean, being scared to death, I think it's one of those things that, so you put it so perfectly when you said he had to have woken up one day and said, oh God, what have we done? But this is one of those, this kind of fear is not persistent. This is a kind of fear that springs up every once and again, and you have to be quick to stamp it out, you know? And I think we can, you know, there's the story of Luther throwing his inkwell at the devil. And it's one of those sorts of things where the fear may crop up from time to time, but you have to quickly stamp it out. And Luther was ultimately a man of great faith. A little later in his life, he would be holding his 14-year-old daughter who was dying, and he would ask her confession of faith, and are you prepared to die in the knowledge of Jesus Christ that you have received, etc. And she says yes. And Luther holds his daughter to his breast and cries, God spare her life, yet not my will but yours be done. And then he holds his daughter as she dies. And that's the kind of, that fear crops up, but that's where that faith comes in to stamp it down, you know, as quickly as you can. You can't let that stand in your way. And I don't think we see Luther letting that fear invade in any sort of way. In addition to working on Bible translations and commentaries, that period of hiding in his life was full of letters. My man wrote a lot during that period of his life.
Yeah. Very productive period indeed.
Very productive.
Well, listeners, I hope everybody's learned a little bit about the life of Martin Luther, some of his views, and some of the things that that maybe inspired him to go in the direction he did. Of course, we didn't get all the way through Luther's life. He's going to live until 1546 when he passes away, I believe, Remy, at the age of 62. So, you know, I guess probably
it was a stroke, I think.
Yeah, in the 16th century, 62 was probably a ripe old age. Today, that would be considered pretty young.
And, you know, Ray, I go back to this just as we're preparing to close it down. But when he died, you know, that was a beautiful story of Luther and his daughter. And, you know, towards the end of Luther's death, I found an interesting quote that was attributed to him that said, quote, when I die, I want to be a ghost so I can continue to pester the bishops and the priests and the godless monks until that they have more trouble with a dead Luther than they could have had before with 1,000 living ones. And so, as we've had today, a petition to the Pope to please remove the excommunication of Luther, I think that Lutherans today are still fighting that cause for the beauty and the power of what Luther did, and that they hold on to that. That is their banner of faith, right? Yeah. That you stand in the face of adversity, and that you continue to carry on the truth, and that it is that by faith alone, and that understanding of what true righteous faith is all about. So I'm really grateful for us having this conversation. I think it's beautiful. I think our listeners have probably discovered more about Luther. I know that I have, and I'm fascinated. I thought this was a great episode, and I'm really thankful for Remy coming and sharing his expertise with it.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me on. I would like to say, just as a quick interjection to that last point, Luther always felt and held to the idea, and this is something that we still feel today culturally in Lutheranism, is that Luther never left the Catholic Church, but rather the Catholic Church left Luther. Right. We very much, and this is obviously controversial to say to a Roman Catholic, but we very much believe that they were the schismatics in all of the events of the Reformation, not us. That we continued with the faith once delivered for all to the apostles, and that they schism, that the Roman Catholic Church was formed in the 1500s at the Reformation, not at Jesus, that the Lutheran Church was founded by Christ. So it's when you talk about fighting for the faith, that is something that we hold very dear. And to this day, people still think we're too combative.
Yeah. And, if our listeners want more from Remy, discussions about Lutheranism, I know, Remy, that you interview a number of people within Lutheranism on your podcast. They can look up his podcast, Lutheran Answers. We will link to that podcast in the description for this particular episode of our podcast, so that you can visit that podcast and listen to some of those episodes. They are very enlightening, I can tell you. We do ask that you share this program with your friends and family. As always, you can find us on Spotify, Sounder FM, Stitcher, Google. You can email us with suggestions and comments at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter U, should know @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.